On the posuk, Vayikchu Shnei Bnei Yaakov, Shimon v'Levi, Achei Dina Ish Charboy, etc. This is the posuk referring to Shimon and Levi going and killing the people of Shechem. The term Ish is used, Ish Charboy. The Chazal tell us that at this point, Shimon and Levi were both 13 years old. And in fact, this is where we learn out the concept that Ben Shlosh Esrei Mitzvahs, that a 13-year-old is obligated in mitzvahs. Since at the age of 13, the Torah is referring to them as Ish, and Ish, a man, represents on adulthood, a man being big, as the Rebbe brings other psukim that bring out this idea, Misamcha le'ish, a pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu is told, who made you into a man, V'chazakta v'hayisa le'ish, a pasuk that David HaMelech is telling Shlomo HaMelech. So that means that at 13 years old, a person, a boy, comes to that level of being a grown-up, an adult. He's now a gadol. He's now an adult as far as his seichel, his da'as, his knowledge, his understanding, his maturity. And this is why he's mechuyev. He's now obligated in all the mitzvahs. Now, even though it's of course possible that a boy could be quite intellectual and intelligent even before the age of 13, nevertheless, because he's lacking that full da'as, that full level of intellectual maturity and feeling, he doesn't have that appreciation yet for how precious a mitzvah is, how dear and precious a mitzvah is, and great a mitzvah is, as well as not necessarily having that feeling and full appreciation of when one is lacking or missing doing a mitzvah. This is why they're not going to be obligated until this point. The Rebbe says an example is given for this even from other worldly things. That when you have a child before 13 years old, it's possible that he can really understand well intellectually the advantages of having money and greatness and so on. Nevertheless, the true appreciation for money and greatness is still very distant from him. He doesn't really have a true feeling, sense, and appreciation for it, so as much as an adult has. And so too, he doesn't have that full, proper, same, mature appreciation and understanding of what lowliness or poverty might be like. In other words, even though he can understand there's a problem with it, but it's not in the same way as much as an adult that will really feel the chisaron, the problem with lowliness and poverty and so on. And this is why a boy up until that age is not responsible yet for his actions, for his conduct, and you can't place on him the obligation for mitzvahs. So that's what Ish represents. He's now an Ish, now a man. Now the Rebbe says that the Rabbeim would many times, for bar mitzvahs, say a maimer starting with the words Nase Odom, from which we understand that the idea of a bar mitzvah has something to do also with this level called an Odom, not only with the level of Ish. Now, Adam is actually a higher level than the level of Ish. It's explained in a number of places that there are 4 different titles, 4 different names with which humans are called: Adam, Ish, Gever, and Enosh. The highest of all of these is the name Adam, which represents Shleimus, which represents perfection. So the Rebbe asks, since the obligation of a 13-year-old for mitzvahs, seemingly for that it's enough just to be an Ish, as described earlier, then why are we also connecting to the idea of a bar mitzvah also with this higher level called an Adam? Now, what is the difference between Ish and Adam? This is going to make the question stronger. The title Ish, the Rebbe says, is referring to a level of seichel, a level of intellect, which has somewhat of a connection in somewhat related to the idea of feelings and midos. In fact, in this itself, there are many, many different levels. And the greatest of all of these, the highest of all of these levels will be when the child or the teenager will reach the age of 20. Now, the level of Adam is beyond that. The level of Adam is representing a certain quality of seichel which is completely beyond midos, completely beyond feelings and so on. If this is the case, the Rebbe says, now the question is even stronger. This idea of the Rabbeim saying Maimorim on the pasuk Nase Adam by bar mitzvah, how could we connect this milah, this special advantage of an Adam, with someone that just turned 13 years old? Says the Rebbe, we must say that the idea is that even though it's true that a bar mitzvah is the time when he becomes an Ish, Nevertheless, at the time when he's fulfilling the mitzvahs, you also have to have infused in the mitzvahs the hashpah, the influence of this level called Adam, as will be discussed. In order to explain this, the Rebbe starts off by saying that the source for this idea that it's not enough just a regular level of ish, but we need something more than that, really could be taken and understood from this pasuk itself about Shimon and Levi taking their swords to go and kill the city of Shechem. Because seemingly, the question could be asked, the chidush, the whole idea that a 13-year-old now has compared to what he had before, for which he's now obligated in mitzvahs, is seemingly not in the idea of midos, not in his emotions, but rather in his seichel, in his understanding, in his mature level of appreciating things, the level of seichel, as we said before, of intellect, which is related somewhat to the emotions. In other words, now that he became a bar das, now that he is fully intellectually capable, now he's able to understand and appreciate, and therefore he accepts upon himself that yoke and that responsibility of Torah and mitzvahs. If that's the case, how is it that we're learning this whole idea from this pasuk of Shimon and Levi, each man taking his sword and going ahead and killing all the people, all the people of Shechem, if the whole idea of this act of taking and killing is coming from actually a very strong and passionate emotions? This is not the idea of seichel. Says the Rebbe, this itself tells us that the idea of this pasuk, that Shimon and Levi go ahead and they kill the men of Shechem, is really, this is containing some message over here and some sort of idea that the level of ish itself would not have, but rather, through this level, this comes to a greater shleimus now. In other words, we have the idea of ish, but you need something more than that to perfect it even more. And this is why we learn out of this pasuk not only the idea that yes, there's a 13-year-old is obligated in mitzvahs because he's an ish, but there's something more that's needed. That within the darga of ish itself, which is not enough, there must be something additional to this, which is hinted and represented in the idea of vayikhu, that they take their swords. Now, before explaining what that is, the Rebbe says, now we'll be able to also understand why the Rabbeim by the Bar Mitzvah would say a maimer with this pasuk, Naasa Adam, because although in general, we said the idea of 13-year-old becoming obligated in mitzvahs, as we said before, is more connected to the level of ish, which represents his maturity and his understanding and so on. Nevertheless, as we just said, that's not going to be enough. We also need an hashpah, similar to what we just said, that's going to be hinted in Vayikhu Ish. There's also the hashpah of Nasa Adam. In other words, what the Nasa Adam idea is going to be a similar concept to how we are going to explain the Vayikhu Ish Charboy. To explain, in regards to the source of the halacha, the Ben Yud Gimel mitzvahs, we actually find two opinions. One opinion is the one that we were discussing till now, that we're learning it out from this pasuk. There is another opinion that it's actually it's one of the shiurim that are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We were given different measurements, halacha l'Moshe Sinai, not with rationale, not with logic. We just said, this is the halacha. The difference, says the Rebbe, is, according to the first opinion, what we're saying is, it's because the child is naturally changing and becoming an adult now, and that this is the nature of most people at 13 years old. They now are mature in their intellect, in their understanding, and so on. And that's why they're becoming bar mitzvah now. According to the second opinion, the moment we say it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, so in other words, this is just a halacha similar to other shiurim, other measurements that are l'Moshe Sinai, so this has nothing to do with the fact that a boy is in a certain state as far as his nature is concerned right now. It's just this is the halacha, at 13 he becomes chayiv in mitzvahs. The practical difference in halacha, says the Rebbe, is, when is it that Bnei Noach become obligated in mitzvahs, in those mitzvahs that they're obligated in? If we should say that the reason for Ben Yud Gimel of mitzvahs is because of the nature of people, that at this age, naturally a boy becomes mature enough, then that would be for Bnei Noach as well, that they become obligated in their mitzvahs at the age of 13. However, if we follow the opinion that the concept of Ben Yud Gimel of mitzvahs is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, now we know in regards to Bnei Noach, none of these shiurim apply. And therefore, we would have to look at each individual goy and see, in his own life, when is this boy mature enough, because of his own personal characteristics, to start becoming obligated to mitzvahs. We're not just going to apply this blanket rule of halacha l'Moshe Messinai that they become bar mitzvah at 13. Says the Rebbe, these two opinions actually play themselves out also very much in avodas Adam. These are two different ways of how the beginning of avodah of a yid fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs needs to be. According to the first opinion, which was saying it's more about the idea that naturally, logically, this is the time that a child becomes of age to be mature. In other words, we're speaking all about something that makes sense. And therefore, we're speaking about an avodah that's also, his service to Hashem is also based on logic. That means that since his whole obligation to fulfilling mitzvahs is dependent on the fact that, yes, naturally this boy is mature now, and now he has the full seichel, the full understanding, and so on. And when he has this appreciation, this sort of feeling for mitzvahs, we can now put on him the obligation of fulfilling the mitzvahs. So that's also telling us that the beginning of his avodah is also going based on, or it's in a way of tam v'das. It's going based on logic. It makes sense. On the other hand, when we look at the second opinion, that the whole idea of a 13-year-old accepting upon himself the whole idea of oil mitzvahs, the yoke of mitzvahs, is all a halacha Moshe Messinai. It's just because that's what Hashem said. It has nothing to do with what the nature of the world is. So in other words, the whole approach right from the outset to Kiyum HaMitzvahs is in this Seder of Avodah of Kabbalah soil. This is what Hashem said. Now says the Rebbe, the truth of the matter is, even according to the first opinion, that we learn it out from our pasuk, Vayikhu Yishcharboy. This is when we learn out the idea that the beginning of Avodah of Ben Yud Gimel of mitzvahs is, as we said, the first opinion explains that this is just a natural thing. And therefore it's an avodah more of al pitam v'das. Nevertheless, from the actual fact that what's the pasuk speaking about? As we just said, it's about them taking their swords. They're going and acting in a way of Mesiras Nefesh. This tells us that even the opinion that says that the avodah of Kiyum HaMitzvahs is usually done with tam v'das, with seichel, with logic, but even this opinion will agree that the avodah itself still needs to be very much connected with Mesiras Nefesh, going beyond seichel. How do these two things work together? Says that it's not a contradiction to what we just said before, that this opinion that learns it out from the pasuk of Vayikhu Yishcharboy, which is the opinion that says that it's just a natural thing, 13-year-old boys are now an ish. So seemingly we're saying it's the avodah of tam v'das, because although, yes, it's true that the avodah is with recognition and appreciation for Torah and mitzvahs, and that's why we're making them obligated and so on, nevertheless, the foundation of the avodah is always Kabbalah soil. The foundation of avodah is always going beyond logic. Because only when one's foundation is Kabbalah soil, then when he goes and does the avodah of Kiyum HaMitzvahs with understanding, only then is it going to be in the right way, when it was based on the Kabbalah soil. The Rebbe says we can see this elsewhere, a proof of this idea. We know that one of the general warnings for Torah and mitzvahs, fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs, the pasuk says, "Re'eino sati lefanecho hayoim." Look, I have placed before you today es hachayim ves hatoiv, that which is life and good, etc. Uvacharto b'chayim, you should choose life. Now, seemingly, the person could see himself with his logic. He could see himself that the way of Torah and mitzvahs is chayim v'toiv, good in life. Then why does the person have to be told uvacharto b'chayim, go and choose life? But the explanation is, if the person's choice of Torah and mitzvahs is based only on his understanding, his logic, and his appreciation that this is life and this is good, then what he's lacking is he's not an oived havaya. He's not a true servant. Because the idea of avodas Hashem is like a servant serves his master. Everything that a servant does is be doing it because of the yoke that he has of the master, that the master placed this on him. And therefore, the bechira, when the person chooses to do Torah and mitzvahs, needs to be in a way of avodas Hashem. It needs to be coming because Hashem commanded us uvacharto b'chayim. What the pasuk is telling us is, starting off and saying that I gave you life and good, what it's coming to emphasize that Torah and mitzvahs is good and this is the way of life, is because Hashem wants that the idea of Torah and mitzvahs should permeate the whole mitzias, the whole entity, the whole person in his totality, and therefore he wants that even in his seichel, in his intellect, he should appreciate that the idea of Torah and mitzvahs is life and good. But again, it needs to be based on Uvacharto, you're choosing it because Hashem said so. Says the Rebbe, now we go back to understand the connection of bar mitzvah with Nasa Adam, how this also ties in with the same idea. And the Rebbe explains, the title Adam really has two meanings to it. Two ideas. One is what we explained in the beginning of the Sicha, that this represents the ultimate perfect seichel, perfect level of intellect. But then Chassidus also explains to us that Adam means something else. The word Adam is the same letters as the word me'oid. Me'oid meaning very much, representing bligvul, going out of all limitations, going beyond seichel, beyond intellect. The Rebbe points out that practically within the person, this is expressed in the fact that a person is a medaber, the person speaks. That's really the Adam aspect of the person. Because this idea of speech of the person is explained in Chassidus is coming from the bligvul aspect within the nefesh, which is really even higher than seichel. But back to the point, we have two aspects in Adam. We have the idea that Adam is the perfection within seichel, the ultimate within seichel. We also have the idea that Adam represents the idea of ma'oi, that it means beyond seichel. Says the Rebbe, because these two ideas are both within the same title, Adam, obviously we have to say that they're connected to each other. So what does that mean in Avodah? Says the Rebbe, because even when the person is on his highest level of seichel, on the level of Adam, which is even way higher than the idea of Ish, you always need to remember this idea of the bligvul that's higher than seichel, the idea of Mesiras Nefesh, the Kabbalah soil that we were speaking about, going completely beyond oneself. And the same thing is true in the reverse. That even when a person has the koyach of Mesiras Nefesh, which is higher than Seichel, he can't just suffice with that. He needs to make sure that the Mesiras Nefesh permeates all of his inner faculties as well, which starts off with the idea of Seichel. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand one of the points of why we say that the hachana for the bar mitzvah, or the idea of the bar mitzvah Maimorim started off with this idea of Nasa Adam, to show this point, that even when you're going to reach the highest level of Seichel and understanding, you're going to reach the level, first of all, that's Shayach Lemidos, and then even beyond that. So you're going to be called Ish. Nevertheless, that's not enough. You always have to have to that avodah. You always have to, it has to be permeated with Ish Charboy, the idea of going out on Mesiras Nefesh, which is higher than that Seichel, which is the same concept of Adam, which, as we said, Adam is the same letters as the word Ma'oid.